Lately, I heard a lot of people saying things like, I believe in the science, you should believe in the science, believe in the science. And there are two things wrong with that claim. Well, first of all, believing the science is a very anti-scientific thing to do, because science is not about believing. Science is according to the scientific method. So it is research, it is testing. It is not believing. Believing is religion. So then the second thing that is wrong with that claim about believing the science is like, okay, what is the science? There's no such thing as the science. What people think they mean by the science is according to scientific research. But first of all, there is no such thing as that all scientists agree with something, that all scientists found the same result. That doesn't exist. Scientists actually never really agree with each other. You know, there's always discussion going on. That is why science, or the scientific method, still exists, because we can keep continuing researching. And that's a good thing, because we never really have the answer to anything. So that's also why there's no such thing as a scientific fact. So let me explain to you how science exactly works and what the scientific method is, because I think it's really important to understand this. So you will understand that there is never such a thing as a scientific fact, or that science agrees. And the reason that I know very well how science works is because for many years I had to study scientific research. And I had to do exams in it, you know, for my bachelor and masters of science. There was never a clear answer, and it drove me crazy. At first, I didn't understand why they didn't just give us facts, you know, like, oh, okay, this is the fact, this is the scientific fact. Well, I found out there is no such thing. So this is how it works. First, there is an observation. You know, for example, I observe that there are a lot of people that are overweight. And I also observe that those people drink a lot of Coke, for example. So then my hypothesis would be, the more Coke you drink, the higher or the more body mass you will have. So in clear language, Coke will make you fat. But that's not how you make an hypothesis. The more Coke you drink, the more body mass you will have. Okay. So after making an hypothesis, you are going to research it. Okay, so how do you research it? You always need an experimental group and a control group. So the experimental group you will manipulate. In this example, one group of people will drink 1 liter of Coke every day for 6 months. And then the control group doesn't do anything. They don't drink Coke. And so before you start this experiment, you measure their body mass. And then after 6 months of the experimental group, the manipulated group, drinking 1 liter of Coke every day, you again measure their body mass and also the body mass of the control group. And then you will find out 2 differences. First, of within the groups, is there a difference in body mass from the start and the end? And then you're going to see the difference between the groups. So between the experimental group and the control group. And then you might find out, the results might be that the experimental group, after 6 months of drinking 1 liter of Coke every day, might have increased in body weight, and the experimental group might not have changed. Okay, so you found an effect, you found a difference. But first, you need to establish whether that effect is significant, because it might be a coincidence. So there's this calculation you need to do. You need to test whether it is a significant difference instead of just a coincidence. And when the chances of this effect being a coincidence is lower than 0.05%, then we can state like, okay, it is significant. But there's a teeny tiny possibility that it is a coincidence. Can you then say, like boldly said, okay, Coke makes you fat? Well, no. First of all, it is according to this research. You can never say like, oh, it's just this in general. Well, you can say we might assume, but we can never say it with 100% certainty. The thing is that you always need to be very careful with your formulation in scientific research. According to this research, we found that people who drink 1 liter Coke every day for 6 months increased in body mass. So there is a correlation, but there's a difference between correlation and causality, because causality means that the Coke makes you fat, but you don't know that for sure, because it might as well be that drinking Coke makes you very hungry, for example. And when you're very hungry, then you start to eat more. And because of eating more, that increases your body mass, maybe. So you don't know for sure. So that is also the thing with science. In a conclusion, you need to discuss what other factors might influence the effect that you found. You also need to explain the things you didn't research that should be researched, should be experimented with in the next research. You should always explain what went wrong during your research, because you can never really have the perfect research. There are always things that are not perfect. So that is very important. So you need to be very, very careful with how you formulate things, and you can never jump to conclusions. And here's what happens. Then these scientists, they write this whole paper about, with their careful formulation, and it might be because of this, it might be because of that, it might be, but according to this research, we found an effect, there is a correlation, but we don't know anything. That's always the conclusion. We actually don't know. And then there is some journalist who wants to write a spicy article for their newspaper or their magazine. And then they take the information from the research and then they leave out all the nuances. And then they say, Coke makes you fat. Okay, but that's not what the article said. No, it doesn't work like that. And then the journalist says, this is a scientific fact. And then other people read it and they're like, oh yeah, according to science, this is a fact. You should believe the science. But first of all, the people that claim to believe the science, they read it somewhere in the newspaper or on internet somewhere, but they didn't actually, I'm sure of it, they didn't read the scientific paper. Because when you read the scientific paper, you can never claim these things. You can never claim such facts, because there's always so much nuance. And then there is another problem. Okay, there are a lot of scientists who try to do honest work. I'm sure of that. But in the end, we live in a world that functions on money. And we all need money to buy food, to pay the rent. So when you are a scientist and you want to make some money, you need to find an effect of what you research. So for example, imagine that drinking 1 liter of Coke every day doesn't make any difference, right? Then you didn't find any effect. Scientific papers are not going to publish studies in general that don't find an effect. So what do you do as a researcher when you just spend a lot of time and money into researching something and you don't find an effect? Well, then there's no money for you. You do need money. So what do you do then? Then you manipulate your data. So there will be an effect anyway. And then you get your money. But that's fraudulent. then you're lying. And then nobody knows because you didn't report exactly what you did, because then everybody would see that you committed fraud, and you're not going to admit to that. You're fraudulent, your research is false, but other people don't know, other researchers don't know. So they take your research and they believe it to be true, they believe it to be honest, and then they do the next research based on the false research. And then there's a problem. Because when you base your new honest research upon a false research, then your honest research is also false because it is based on a lie. And then the third scientist, he's also going to base his work on the false previous works. And this is how a whole lie builds up, a whole falsehood builds itself up. 100 scientists can be honest and did honest research, but if they all based their research upon a false research, and maybe it's not even because this initial scientist was fraudulent, maybe he just made a mistake. It's also when, we all had math in high school. When you make one mistake in your calculations, you get the wrong answer. Even though the rest of the calculations was perfect, but make one little mistake and your answer is wrong. So that also happens in science, of course. When you make a little mistake, then your result is wrong. But if other scientists base their research upon this false, whether it is an honest mistake or whether it is fraudulent, either way, they've based their research upon a falsehood. And then this falsehood, it grows. And then you get this whole paradigm, even a paradigm around this lie, based upon a lie. And then people think it's all true because, this was right and this was right. But the initial research, the base of it all, is false. And that's a big problem. You can also compare it to, when you have a bottle of water and, the water is just fine, it's perfect. But you add one drop of poison to the bottle of water, then the whole bottle of water becomes poison. And that's the thing. When you make one mistake in your calculations, all the calculations might be fine, but one mistake and the answer is wrong. Everything is wrong. And it's also with science. When there's a false research, whether it's fraudulent or it's just an honest mistake, and other people base their research upon this false research, it's all wrong. It's all false. And that's a problem. And then there's the problem that, actually what people should do in science is replicate. Replicating means that you take a previous research and you repeat it. You repeat everything exactly according to how that other researcher did his research. And then, some people did that the last years, and they found out that a lot is wrong, that there were a lot of fraudulent researchers that just wanted to make some money. And there are also people that just made mistakes. And this is why we need to replicate. But the problem with replication is that nobody's going to pay for it. There's no money to be made in it. And then there is another great problem with science, with believing the science, and that is politics. So politicians base their laws, their regulations upon science very often. With the whole climate change, for example. A lot of new laws and a lot of regulations are based upon climate change science. But here's a problem, because there are a lot of people that have interest in particular narrative, a particular conclusion, and people are corrupted. People are corrupted. So you pay a scientist and you say, you need to find this conclusion, and then you get your money. And then the scientist, he finds the conclusion for you. Because there are always ways to find a particular conclusion. There was this research that they did. According to scientific study, people become physically younger by listening to music of the Beatles. And this was scientifically proven. But we all know that this can't be true. You can't become physically younger. What this study actually proves is that you can manipulate data this much that you can actually scientifically prove such a bizarre conclusion. And so it makes a lot of sense that scientists can be paid to find a certain conclusion, to keep a certain narrative alive, so a lot of other people can make money out of that. Because let's be honest, the whole climate change narrative, it is one big money thing. It's all about money. When science goes hand in hand with politics and with money, with this much money, then you need to be careful. You need to be very careful. And the same thing with the whole vaccine and COVID thing, it was a political thing. When science and politics are involved with each other, don't just believe the science. Just follow the money. And one last thing, always keep in mind what the difference is between science and pseudoscience. Real science uses clear language. It follows the evidence wherever it goes. Everybody should be able to research it, should be able to test it, and it should always be open for criticism. That is what real science is. Pseudoscience is very dogmatic. It first draws a conclusion and then it makes some research based on that conclusion. It cherry picks. There's a lot of fraud involved with it, like I just told you with the money thing. And it's always about these grandiose claims. For example, the whole climate change thing, in 100 years, then it will be this and that. You can't test that. Nobody can prove that. So it's all based on a theory. It's all based on a model. But you can't prove that. Also claims about millions of miles away from us, like whether it's under the ground or up in the air. You can't prove that. Everybody needs to be able to test it. When there's only a few people in the world that claim to be able to test this, to prove this, pseudoscience. Also vague language, not clearly stated, very dogmatic, and is not open to criticism. The whole climate change thing, the whole COVID thing, it's not open to criticism. I actually know people who got death threats because their criticism on the whole climate change narrative. So, pseudoscience. So yeah, science, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting topic, but I think it needs to be clear to people what is the difference between actual science, the scientific methods, and the whole science, religion kind of thing. There is a big difference between those two, and I hope I explained you well. I hope you learned something from this video. And also, of course, if you want to understand your dreams, go to my website. You can schedule a free conversation with me. I can help you understand your unconscious. And so I put the link down below, and maybe I see you soon.